So I'm sitting in my car in the car park outside WA's Parliament House. And I remember thinking to myself, well, this is the last place I want to be. I'd already spent years advocating to politicians, but this time was different. I was on a quest to ensure that my justice didn't have a time limit and that my voice mattered. You see, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. But we've skipped ahead a bit, so let's go back a little. By late 2016, we'd already been on this mission for over 2 years, and our objective was to remove the limitation period preventing survivors from bringing a civil action against the perpetrator or the responsible institution. Imagine telling an almost 40-year-old woman who was first sexually assaulted by her teacher at around age 8 that her justice had a time limit and it had already expired. Well, we'd had some success in approaching our local members and we had a bill. But that bill was just consistently deprioritised by the government of the day until it was picked up as a sort of political football for some parliamentary theatrics in the lead up to the 2017 election. Theatrics we were forced to observe in silence. That failure was pure devastation to me. Well, with the change of government, I had renewed hope. But where to now? I continued working with my local member, and a new bill was being drafted. But with each news story to hit the headlines, more and more other legislation was being pushed through first. People and organisations with louder voices than ours were getting things done. And our attempts to access the media showed us that there was very little interest at the time. So how could we be heard? Other than to keep up the pressure with my local member, I knew that I had to meet with more than just my local representative. But how was I going to reach the other parliamentarians? I realised that to be effective, I had to go to them in person and give it a face. But I wasn't their constituent, so they weren't likely to even take an appointment with me. One day, dropped my daughter at school, just like any other day. And the next thing I knew, I was driving to WA's Parliament House, only to find myself in that car park. But this time was different, as I said, and pretty soon I was sitting up in the public gallery of the WA Lower House. I should mention at this point that years before, and very early in my journey, I dyed my hair bright blue, all over. It was my own personal protest against the limitation period. I hadn't even told anyone why I'd done it. I chose the colour to honour an organisation called Blue Knot, who support survivors. So to be fair, although my approach was basically a silent protest, the hair was pretty loud. And it certainly made me very visible up there. And it also meant that a few key players recognised me from previous visits and connected my presence with the issue. By the time I'd been up there an hour, well, I knew it wasn't going to be fun, but I also knew that I was going to be there every day until it was done. My presence was my message. I couldn't speak. That message was, you have constituents who are survivors. They need your support. In me, they're all here, waiting for you to do your job. And we're not going away until it's done. Okay, I'll admit, that sounds pretty confrontational. But I was doing it in a really non-confrontational way. I wasn't shouting anything from the gallery or doing anything actively attention-seeking. Having lost in what felt like such abject humiliation the last time, it was really important to me to walk away from this with my dignity and self-respect intact. Pretty soon my presence was being acknowledged from both sides of the aisle and the media. But that hair, let me tell you, you could spot me from a distance. And I'm not just talking about my time in Parliament, but also out in the community. Please understand, we survivors carry our trauma, our emotions, our damage, just our status as a survivor at varying depths on our person, as a matter of course in our daily lives. Okay, so that depth is frequently just below the surface. But we're generally masters at concealing our emotions and keeping these things private. We call it our mask. Well, that privacy, specifically of my status as a survivor, was no longer in any moment mine. Nevertheless, I was there to do a job. And I was succeeding in breaking down the barriers to communication and building genuine relationships. I am not politically savvy. I was just being myself, engaging in conversations, sending thank you notes. There were definitely some respectful disagreements, but just all the normal human interaction stuff. Eventually, politicians were coming up to visit me in my new office in the public gallery, asking about the bill, discussing other survivor issues. Over time, they'd drop in just to say hi or ask me about something completely unrelated. Well, who gets that kind of access? Had I somehow found my voice in this place of silence? I'd given them respect and trust, and it was being returned to me. And what had we built here on this journey together? This was now a group of leaders, previously pretty disengaged with survivors, who were enthusiastic and passionate about my issue. My voice was being heard by those who could make change. My silent protest had lasted more than 6 months, but was ultimately successful. In April 2018, the new bill made its final passage through the Parliament of Western Australia, and I was there to witness it all. Survivors of childhood sexual abuse can now bring a civil action against the perpetrator or the responsible institution, no matter how long ago that abuse occurred. Their voices will be heard in district courts throughout the state. It matters that survivors have access to pathways to justice when they finally find their voice. For too long, victims have been at best silenced, or worse, disbelieved, or even rendered homeless or institutionalised for their outrageous claims. The Australian Childhood Foundation tells us that 1 in 3 adult Australians would not believe a child who disclosed abuse to them. And yet we know there are an extraordinary number of survivors out there. When a story comes out about a predator, society is justifiably angry, and they voice their opinions with passion and in great number. Far more constructive would be a transformation of that energy and outrage into support and action for survivors and for prevention. Let's change the discourse and shift the focus to what we can do to improve this world. For me, that was just showing up day in, day out, to get legislation passed so that my voice mattered, even after all these years. For you, it's changing who you listen to and which stories and narratives you perpetuate. Thank you.